Ladies, gentlemen, and haradrim of all ages, as time has passed and things have settled, even the recent hotfix actually changing things up a bit quite massively for a day or two, the sort of rankings of the top current artificers pit clears are relatively calming down. And given the way that this activity works, it is sort of the best way that we currently have access to properly judge a class by its overall strength, and it's the only direct ranking that we have for builds as a result. So today we're going to go over what are factually the 10 best builds in the game as far as highest pit tier completions right now, with the caveat that this is of course pit specific and builds made for the pit have different focuses than what your average player will want to focus on, given that most people don't have a need to push past tier 80 or so in the pit if you're just farming for materials, and these are all just designed to be done at 125 tier or above really as far as the amount of survivability needed, at which point you need just insane defense as a baseline and then just to have enough movement speed to actually dodge the things that would still one-shot you anyways. Point being, if you're just looking for a speed farming build to run through Helltide or Nightmare dungeons or do lower tier pits, there are better options than these. But today is focused on the top 10 builds in pit progress at this immediate point in the season, and I mean that in a very literal way, as spoiler here, we aren't even going to talk about Druid builds today, because the other 4 classes have enough separate builds between them now that have just cleared higher pit tiers. And then finally, one final disclaimer, obviously this video is being made before it is being uploaded, so the exact order of the ranking may change a bit, but without major game changes, these will still be the top 10 builds right now, regardless of the precise placement of them. Starting off the very top then, this is a relatively simple one. It's the Necromancer golem build, but specifically using holy bolts, and this slot is essentially just literally for the concept of how broken this bug is. There are Necromancer builds that we will talk about without this bug, and it's worth mentioning that without holy bolts included, the base build in use here, which is golem Necromancer, would still be in around 7th place even on this list even without this, but holy bolts is just so busted that it pushes the whole thing up here. The bug is confusing as hell really as to how it works, but the general understanding that we have of it is that your minions have weird interactions that cause them to just burst for loads of holy damage sort of at random, with the most noticeable effects of this being with golem focused builds, as it seems to scale with the actual base hit damage to begin with, and golem builds are all about bursts, so when that works in tandem, you just bug a boss to death in no time flat. Generally speaking though, this is just based off the high damage that minions can scale to now, double dipping with player and minion bonuses as minions take all player stats, taking advantage of things like blood mist for survivability when necessary, corpse tendrils both to trigger buffs and for crowd control too, but most importantly the combo of Army of the Dead with Unyielding Commanders aspect to give you a massive minion damage boost while the ultimate is active, Skeleton Priest to boost your minions, and then just using the golem active for an absolutely massive thwack of a pop of damage, and all of this is just made better by using holy bolts really. Second up then, we have our first sorcerer build of the day, called Fire Kuna by its creator, and the essential goal of this build is to have 100% uptime on Flame Shield for literal immunity to all damage, which is accomplished by using the Hectic aspect and having Flame Shield be the only cooldown skill on your bar, then stacking just an insane amount of cooldown reduction as well, but once you have reached that threshold, you become immortal, and the question becomes just how can you best do damage while in this situation? And for reference, this has jumped up close to 20 whole tiers in completion since the hotfix that fixed a bunch of sorcerer stuff that wasn't being calculated properly, to the point of, at the time of making this, just being the #1 pit tier clear without holy bolts in the game, which actively happened while I was in the middle of making this and talking about all these builds, so apologies if it does cause a little bit of confusion, but the main focus of this is of course a basic skill for maximum attack speed and thus cooldown reduction procs, so you take Firebolt, use the brand new Flameweaver unique to cause it to split and deal bonus damage when sent through Firewall, bring along Frostbolt mostly just as a cold damage type trigger, and then use Raiment of the Infinite to make the random enemies in the first portion of the pit die faster, which then just gives you more time to plink away at the boss while immortal until they die. Following that we have Thorns Barbarian, and this one is based off the opening point. The Barbarians at this stage of pit progression are using some silly scaling to make themselves nearly immortal by having around 400,000 life. Not even effective life, but actual genuine life before even counting damage reductions. And the simple explanation of this is a combination of greater affix and masterworking upgrades on maximum life bonuses, some passives that boost maximum life, and then all of that combined with a greater affix Doombringer with masterworking major upgrades on the maximum life percentage, and all that together just scales to ridiculous life numbers as a result. Past that, there are multiple barb builds doing extremely well because with that in play, they just focus the rest of the build on the damage. For Thorns Barbarian, this is a fun combo of just an unbelievably god-tier roll on Razor Plate for a ridiculous amount of thorns, greater affixes, good masterworking, things like that, the tempering affixes that give you percent thorns while fortified, and then stacking earthquakes on top of each other with earthquake duration, weapon tempers, low cooldown leap, and the Rumble Paragon glyph, which infinitely scales damage per active earthquake that you are standing inside of. And you can see quite quickly how this has gotten just a little bit out of control, as much as it has. Third today then, we have Heartseeker Rogue, which might well go up a spot by the time this is up, because it's been pushing a bit further since the hotfix a couple of days ago, but the main thing this build focuses on is just reaching the absolute maximum attack speed, accomplished by using Heartseeker as a basic skill, the various aspects that boost basic skills by unnatural amounts like Moonrise and Adaptability, Rapid for bonus attack speed on basics 2, chance to cast bonus projectiles from the weapon temper, and then combining this with the Victimize key passive, which is just insanely strong for Rogue right now, giving you a lucky hit chance for each shot to deal a massive explosion of damage that scales endlessly with your damage against vulnerable enemies stat. And then for defense, you just lean hard into Dark Shroud for general damage reductions, dodge chance, and pure movement to avoid the damage itself in the first place. Fourth up is our first repeat class, which is Frenzy Rupture Barbarian. This was actually a fair bit down in the rankings until literally minutes before I sat down to make this, where it shot up to a tier 133 completion. Good on you for pushing so far so quickly, absolutely for sure. As for the build, you're going to notice a pattern pretty soon here, not necessarily of class, but of reasoning. The main reason that this does so well is that it has the same access to survivability skills as other Barbarian builds and can do things like we mentioned earlier, but damage-wise, it is mostly based around the Hemorrhage Legendary Paragon node, which infinitely scales bleed damage with vulnerable damage as a really strong double dip, but combine that with the Wanton Rupture aspect and Rupture itself, and you can explode your enemy for a portion of their current bleed damage, reapply a portion of that, and not actually remove the previous damage to begin with. So if you time this properly, you can essentially have what amounts to infinitely stackable bleed damage given the time to build it up, and then the rest of the build is just focused around reaching near immortality through cooldown reductions with Iron Skin as well as shouts, and then just popping big numbers on repeat, with Rupture both working to stack bleed damage on bosses, as mentioned before, but also to pop open larger groups of enemies in the first portion of the pit as well. Following that, we actually have our third Barbarian build. I know, another one this fast, but this one is Bleed Bash Barbarian. It functions mostly off of similar things I have mentioned for the other two builds, the insane survivability, and then taking advantage of the Hemorrhage Paragon node for a strong double dip modifier. Then it just uses Bash, which is an extremely strong basic skill that only scales into more and more ridiculousness when you have better stats and better gear as a result. Not to mention, you work critical strike damage offense tempers from a rogue onto your gear that you have on the same account, a sort of silly trick when in combination with using the Grandfather as your two-handed sword, which combines together for insane crit multiplier stacking, which then further interacts with the Gushing Wounds key passive for Barbarian to increase your bleed damage by 140% of your critical strike damage when you crit on a bleed, which then of course just stacks into crazy levels of damage pumping. After that, quite immediately actually, we have our second Sorcerer build, which is Shatter Firebolt, based off a lot of the same principles of cooldown reduction focused on Flame Shield for immortality. This build doesn't use Raiment of the Infinite, and it has a bit more in terms of skills on your bar, including some that will take up some of your Hectic procs. And you can see that this results in a bit of dying in this run, but even so, they get the boss down with plenty of time to spare. And the main differences of this one is working in Inferno as an ultimate and focusing around the Shatter key passive for massive bonus damage after freezing enemies. But this works best, of course, on bosses, which count as frozen when stunned, and you just pile everything you have onto them there when they are stunned, which then pops at the end of it for a massive burst. Essentially, this one winds up with very similar damage, achieved with some relatively notable differences as to how, even though they are using the same main skills. But the other build proves to just be a bit more comfortable, as it is just fully immortal forever, really. Then next up, we have our second rogue build, which is focused on Penetrating Shot as a core skill. The basis of this one is essentially just using Penetrating Shot's ability to stack lucky hit chance with combo points to then take significant advantage of the Victimize key passive once again, as this is just an incredibly broken scaling source for a rogue, and this is just a completely different focused way of building around its damage, where you manage traps and have to fire out basic skills in between your Penetrating Shot to stack the combo points for the full effect, but otherwise it is actually quite similar to the Heartseeker heartseeker build. After that, up in 9th, we have our other Necromancer build for the day, which is another minion build this time that instead of focusing around golem for big bursts, focuses around shadow mages for a lot more consistent damage, and for triggering of the Shadow Blight key passive for loads of bonus damage scaling, and double dipping with minion bonuses just like the golem build does. It's worth mentioning here as well that the golem build without Holy Bolt's elixir is still better than this, just not by an absolutely massive amount, as they are pretty close in top pit tier completions without the elixir. For the most part, this rests on the exact same tools as the golem build, just again refocusing where the actual bulk of the damage comes from, being golem burst to being much more consistent shadow mage output over time really. Then in our final slot today, we have something that was totally broken, but then was fixed up with a recent hotfix, which is Rapid Fire Rogue. Instead of focusing on scaling through attack speed like Heartseeker does, or purely through Victimize like the Penetrating Shot build, this instead uses more scaling through various crowd control based damage bonuses like Chill and Freeze effects, and then just applying Frost Imbuement to a million different rapid fire shots lobbed out from Scoundrel's Kiss, with the percentage chance to double cast rapid fire as well, which is sort of silly. And this one is just exceptionally strong, but doesn't break quite as much as the other two rogue builds that were on the list before it. It's still incredibly respectable, but from what I can tell, it's really hard to beat anywhere comparable to the top rogue builds right now without using a build that is designed to make the absolute most of the Victimize key passive specifically more than anything else. And that just about does it for today then everyone. The top 10 builds in all of Diablo 4 right now according to top pit tier completions. Again, a reminder that these rankings do shift at least somewhat relatively often, but generally speaking, these 10 builds are just going to be the 10 builds that fit this bill until any major changes happen to the game. And again, I want to reiterate that if you are just like hitting Torment, if you're level 60 or 70, even if you're level 100, but your main content that you're clearing is stuff like Helltides and lower tier pits, these builds are absolutely not the ones for you. They are focused entirely on survivability to just a ridiculous point that is just overkill for most players, but then just fitting in as much damage as they can as a second point. These aren't general use builds. They have one purpose, which is crushing the pit, and they do it incredibly well. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and it's just a sort of roundup and deeper look into the builds that are just crushing the pit the best right now. I know it's always something that interests me on a personal level at least, so I hope you've enjoyed this too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.